Inside Unit 29, Mississippi's most dangerous cell block. Few prisons in America have earned a reputation as dark and dangerous as Unit 29 at the Mississippi State Penitentiary, better known as Parchman Farm. Behind those razor-sharp fences lies a place where heat, violence, and neglect collide. It's not fiction, it's one of the deadliest cell blocks in the modern U.S. prison system. Tonight, we're stepping inside Unit 29, where inmates live in collapsing cells, guards fear for their safety, and the state itself has been sued for letting the chaos unfold.
Before we dive into today's powerful story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping tales. Your support helps us keep sharing these stories, and we wouldn't want you to miss any of the action. Now, let's get started.
The legacy of Parchman Farm. Mississippi State Penitentiary, known simply as Parchman, is no ordinary prison. Spread across 18,000 acres of the Mississippi Delta, it's often described as a prison wrapped inside a plantation. Established in 1901, the facility was built on land that once held enslaved people, and that legacy still echoes through its walls today. For decades, inmates at Parchman were forced to work the cotton fields under the blistering southern sun. They picked crops, chopped wood, and farmed the land, not for wages, but for the state's profit. The image of the trustee system, where armed inmates supervised other prisoners, became symbolic of Mississippi's brutal penal past. Even in the modern era, that image hasn't fully disappeared. By the 2000s, Parchman was home to more than 3,000 inmates, divided across several housing units, each with a different level of security. Unit 29, located at the far northern edge of the complex, was supposed to house the state's most dangerous offenders, men serving life sentences, or those with histories of violence and escape attempts. But what it became, was something far worse. Inside Unit 29, reports began to emerge of collapsing ceilings, raw sewage flooding cells, and electrical systems so old they sparked fires. Prisoners described sleeping on concrete floors beside overflowing toilets. Guards described shifts where they were outnumbered 10-1. And over the years, the state received dozens of warnings from watchdog groups, journalists, and even the U.S. Department of Justice, all documenting the same thing: Parchman's Unit 29 was breaking down from the inside. The situation worsened as Mississippi slashed prison budgets during the 2010s. Staffing shortages became critical. Security posts went unmanned for entire shifts. According to internal audits later made public, the facility operated at times with less than 50% of its required correctional officers. That meant cell checks weren't completed, searches were skipped, and gangs began to control what the guards could not. It wasn't long before violence filled the void. By 2019, inmates had begun smuggling weapons through compromised fences and trading contraband phones that documented their conditions to the outside world. In early 2020, those phones would reveal something that shocked the nation. Graphic images and videos of blood-streaked walls, riots, and lifeless bodies sprawled across the floors of Unit 29. The Mississippi Department of Corrections initially downplayed the chaos, calling it isolated incidents. But soon, the truth became impossible to hide. The breaking point: the 2020 Parchman riots. By the end of 2019, Mississippi's prison system was a powder keg, and Unit 29 was the spark. What began as isolated fights quickly escalated into a series of violent uprisings that would leave multiple inmates dead and expose years of systemic neglect. A system on the brink. The warning signs were everywhere. Internal audits and watchdog reports had already flagged Parchman's Unit 29 for failing basic safety standards. The cells were overcrowded, surveillance cameras often didn't work, and routine maintenance had nearly collapsed. Former corrections officers described units where locks didn't lock and flooded toilets became normal. The American Civil Liberties Union (ACLU) and Southern Poverty Law Center had long warned that such conditions would lead to catastrophe. But the crisis came faster than anyone expected. On December 29, 2019, tensions flared in a different facility, South Mississippi Correctional Institution, SMCI, in Leakesville, where 2 inmates were killed in fights believed to be gang-related. Within hours, the violence began to ripple across the state system. Phones smuggled into Parchman started buzzing with warnings, "It's coming here next." Then, on January 2, 2020, chaos hit Unit 29. Inside the uprising. Shortly before dawn, officers in Unit 29 reported multiple disturbances. What they found when they entered the cell block was described by one investigator as a war zone. Inmates had pried open cell doors with broken metal parts and flooded the tiers. Videos filmed on contraband phones showed men covered in blood, shouting for help, while others ran from cell to cell armed with homemade knives, shanks fashioned from mop handles, steel rods, and even broken sinks. The Mississippi Department of Corrections, MDOC, initially said it had the situation under control. But by the following morning, 5 inmates were confirmed dead across several prisons, 3 of them inside Parchman. Photos and videos began leaking online, hallways splattered with blood, smashed light fixtures, and bodies lying in open dorms with no staff in sight. The public reaction was immediate and fierce. Local news outlets, including the Clarion-Ledger, published interviews with inmates' families describing unanswered calls and panicked messages from inside. One mother told reporters her son texted, "Mom, they killing everybody in here." The gang factor. Officials quickly attributed the killings to a conflict between 2 of Mississippi's most powerful prison gangs, the Vice Lords and the Gangster Disciples. Both organizations had long competed for control of the illicit economy inside Parchman, drugs, phones, and protection rackets. With guards outnumbered and surveillance systems barely functional, entire zones of Unit 29 had effectively fallen under gang rule. One former correctional officer told Mississippi Today, "There are places we just don't go. You step in, and you might not come out." The U.S. Department of Justice would later confirm that prison staff shortages allowed gangs to dominate entire units, determining who could move, eat, or even sleep in certain bunks. State response and fallout. Governor Tate Reeves, newly elected at the time, toured Parchman days after the riots. Standing before the press, he described what he saw as unacceptable and vowed to restore order. But activists pointed out that the crisis had been building for years, underfunding, outdated facilities, and corruption had turned the state's prisons into what one civil rights lawyer called a constitutional nightmare. As the smoke cleared, investigators recovered dozens of homemade weapons and phones from the wreckage. Reports revealed that maintenance requests for basic repairs, locks, lighting, and plumbing, had been ignored for months. Inmates in Unit 29 were left in darkness for long periods because electrical systems had shorted out, and some cells had no running water. Federal civil rights lawsuits soon followed. Inmates alleged that staff abandoned their posts during the violence, leaving prisoners locked in with dead bodies for hours. One survivor later told reporters, "We were sleeping next to corpses. Nobody came for 2 days." The turning point. The 2020 riots became a national story. Celebrities like JayZ and Yo Gotti joined forces through the Reform Alliance to fund lawsuits demanding investigations into the Mississippi Department of Corrections. Their lawsuit accused the state of failing to provide humane conditions and allowing unconstitutional levels of violence. By mid-2020, more than 30 inmates had died across Mississippi prisons, from stabbings, suicides, and medical neglect. Most of the deaths occurred in Parchman, and most of those in Unit 29. As outrage spread, the state temporarily shut down portions of the unit, promising renovations. But for many, that was too little, too late. The damage, both physical and psychological, had already been done. The collapse, inside the walls of Unit 29. Even after the blood had dried and the headlines faded, Unit 29 remained a monument to neglect. Behind the official statements and political promises, the reality inside Mississippi's most notorious cell block was grim, a crumbling structure that symbolized decades of disregard for human life. Inside the walls. Unit 29 was originally designed for high-security housing, but by the late 2010s, its infrastructure had deteriorated so badly that it no longer met basic correctional standards. Investigators, lawyers, and even former staff described scenes that sounded more like a disaster zone than a modern prison. Rusted bars, leaking roofs, inoperable toilets, and light fixtures dangling by exposed wires. Inmates told inspectors that rats and roaches infested their cells. The temperature in summer often exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with no air conditioning or ventilation. Winters brought freezing drafts through cracked windows. Some prisoners resorted to burning paper or plastic inside makeshift containers for warmth, filling the air with toxic smoke. The Mississippi Department of Corrections acknowledged that maintenance had fallen far behind, but internal memos later revealed how deep the neglect ran. Between 2017 and 2019, over 700 maintenance requests were logged for Unit 29 alone, ranging from electrical hazards to broken locks, yet fewer than one-third were completed. In one report filed by a state inspector, the summary line read simply, "Unit 29 is unsafe for both inmates and staff. Sewage, mold, and filth." The most disturbing condition was the sanitation. Drainage systems failed so frequently that raw sewage sometimes backed up into the cells. Photos taken during federal inspections showed inches of standing water, dark, foul-smelling liquid that mixed with food scraps and insects. Inmates used plastic bottles and buckets to scoop it out just to sleep on the floor. Mold spread across the ceilings and walls. Prisoners said they could taste it in the air. The smell of rot was so strong that correctional officers often kept masks on, long before COVID made them mandatory. When a 2019 storm damaged the roof, parts of the ceiling in several cells caved in, leaving holes that went unrepaired for months. One inmate wrote in a letter smuggled to reporters, "Rain pours in like a shower. We use trash bags to cover our beds. Broken locks and broken order." Perhaps the most dangerous failure in Unit 29 was its locking system. For years, cells and gates either didn't lock properly or could be opened from the inside using improvised tools. A 2020 investigation by Mississippi Today revealed that staff frequently relied on makeshift fixes, wedging metal pieces or padlocks into place, because official repair parts were unavailable or too costly. This allowed violent inmates to roam freely during the night. According to court filings, assaults often occurred when prisoners from rival gangs broke into other cells after lights out. One correctional officer stated in an affidavit, "We don't control the doors anymore. The inmates do." The Department of Justice later cited this as one of the most severe constitutional violations in Mississippi's prison system, calling it deliberate indifference to life-threatening risks. Medical neglect and psychological strain. Physical conditions were only part of the horror. Medical care in Unit 29 was described as sporadic at best. Inmates with chronic illnesses reported waiting weeks for medication. Those suffering mental health crises were often placed in isolation, sometimes for months, without counseling or supervision. In a 2020 NBC News interview, one former inmate recounted how a diabetic prisoner went days without insulin, collapsing in his cell before receiving treatment. Others spoke of untreated infections, skin diseases, and tooth decay. A letter from another inmate read, "We live in filth and fear. People get sick, and they just disappear." Federal inspectors confirmed that Parchman lacked adequate medical staff. At times, only one nurse was on duty for hundreds of inmates across multiple units. The prison's medical record system was largely paper-based, making it nearly impossible to track patient history or medication schedules. Guards on edge. Correctional officers were victims of the same system. Low pay and long hours drove many to quit, leaving those who remained severely overworked. Reports showed some officers earning barely $27,000 a year, among the lowest in the nation for correctional staff. With morale collapsing, many guards stopped reporting safety violations altogether. They simply tried to survive each shift. A veteran officer told the Clarion-Ledger. "You go in hoping to make it home. That's all. Nobody wants to work Unit 29, it's hell." The shortage meant that officers were sometimes responsible for supervising up to 100 inmates alone. In emergencies, backup was often unavailable, leaving guards trapped or forced to retreat and lock themselves in offices until reinforcements arrived. The combination of desperation, neglect, and fear created a feedback loop. The more the system broke down, the harder it became to repair. Federal scrutiny intensifies. By 2021, the Department of Justice had opened a full civil rights investigation into Mississippi's prisons, focusing heavily on Parchman and specifically Unit 29. Federal officials visited the site, took photographs, and interviewed dozens of inmates and staff. Their preliminary findings confirmed years of warnings. The conditions were unconstitutional, unsafe, and unsanitary. The DOJ report cited a pattern of violence and neglect and concluded that the state had failed to take reasonable measures to protect prisoners from physical harm. It also warned that without immediate reform, Mississippi could face federal oversight similar to what Alabama's prisons had endured after similar findings. Mississippi promised improvements, new lighting, better plumbing, and temporary housing relocations, but many doubted real change would come. Years of neglect had hollowed out not only the infrastructure but also the trust of those living and working inside. Voices from the inside, testimonies of survival and desperation. If the walls of Unit 29 could speak, they would tell stories soaked in fear, desperation, and endurance. But the people who lived and worked there, the inmates, the officers, the families waiting for calls that never came, have already spoken. Their words paint the most haunting picture of all. Letters from the cell. In the aftermath of the 2020 riots, hundreds of handwritten letters began to reach reporters, lawyers, and advocacy groups. Many came from inmates in Unit 29 who had smuggled notes out through visitors or sympathetic guards. One prisoner wrote simply, "We sleep with one eye open. The floor is wet with sewage. The lights don't work. The screams never stop." Another described the emotional toll. "I've been here 9 years. I've seen more men die than I can count. You start to forget what silence feels like." A third man, transferred temporarily to another unit after the riots, said he didn't want to leave his cell because freedom in Parchman means walking into danger. These testimonies, verified through advocacy groups like the Mississippi Center for Justice, gave a voice to those trapped behind the razor wire. Their accounts were consistent. Filth, fear, and abandonment had become daily life. The officers' reality. The guards' stories weren't much different. Interviews with correctional officers revealed a workforce just as broken as the facility itself. Several spoke anonymously to Mississippi Today, saying they were ashamed but powerless. One former sergeant recalled, "I'd beg for backup and no one would come. We had no radios, no working cameras. You just prayed your shift would end without blood." Many officers suffered post-traumatic stress after witnessing assaults and suicides. Some resigned mid-shift, leaving their badges behind. Those who stayed did so out of obligation, not to the system, but to the few human lives they still felt responsible for. Families left waiting. Outside Parchman, families became investigators, reporters, and advocates. Mothers and sisters collected letters, filed open records requests, and organized protests outside the state capitol in Jackson. They held up photos of their sons, some dead, others missing, demanding answers from a system that had gone silent. A mother named Carolyn Jones, whose son died during the 2020 unrest, told NBC News. "They told me he was fine. Then I saw his picture online, he was lying on the floor. I can't sleep knowing what he went through in there." Families like hers helped push the state toward accountability. Their grief forced public officials to confront what had long been ignored. A turning tide. Under increasing federal scrutiny, Mississippi finally began addressing Parchman's crisis. In 2022, portions of Unit 29 were closed for renovation. The state transferred some inmates to other facilities and signed contracts for new lighting, plumbing, and locks. Governor Tate Reeves announced a new era of corrections reform, promising transparency and safety. But advocates remain skeptical. They argue that until Mississippi tackles why its prisons collapse, underfunding, overcrowding, and neglect, the same tragedies will repeat. Even after repairs, inspections revealed that some cells in Unit 29 still lacked running water, and staff shortages persisted. Federal oversight remains a possibility if improvements stall. Legacy of Unit 29. Today, Unit 29 stands as both a cautionary tale and a mirror of America's broader prison crisis. It's a reminder that punishment without dignity leads not to justice, but to decay, and that silence, left too long, becomes complicity. In the words of a former inmate now released, they called it Unit 29. We called it survival. And survival, for many, was the only justice they ever received. The story of Unit 29 isn't just about one cell block in Mississippi. It's about what happens when a system designed to enforce order collapses into chaos, when indifference becomes policy, and neglect becomes normal. From the cotton fields of Parchman's past to the blood-stained cells of its present, the lesson remains painfully clear. A society is measured not by how it treats the free, but by how it treats the confined. What you've seen tonight isn't fiction. It's America's forgotten corner, a place where history and humanity collided inside concrete walls. If you believe stories like these deserve to be told, hit subscribe, leave a comment below, and share this documentary. Every voice raised brings another ray of light into the darkness of places like Unit 29. This is the Unspoken Stories. Thank you for watching, and never forget the voices inside.